I can still smell his cologne on the divorce papers. Dior Sauvage, the scent I'd given him for our anniversary just 3 months earlier. As I stood there in our marble foyer, staring at Richard's handwriting on the envelope, the world seemed to tilt sideways. 40 years of marriage, packed into a manila envelope with a sticky note that simply read, "Ellie, please sign. My lawyer needs these by Friday." No, I'm sorry. No explanation, just a Friday deadline, as if I were one of his corporate acquisitions with a closing date. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I walked to our antique liquor cabinet, the one we'd found at that little shop in Vermont during our 10th anniversary trip, and poured myself a glass of the 30-year-old scotch he'd been saving for a special occasion. Well, the end of 4 decades together seemed special enough. The amber liquid burned my throat as I settled into the window seat that overlooked our manicured garden, the roses I'd pruned just that morning now seeming like they belonged to someone else's life. I took another sip, longer this time, and finally opened the envelope. "Irreconcilable differences," the papers said. How clinical. How insufficient to describe what happens when your husband of 40 years decides that his 38-year-old secretary makes him feel alive again. But here's the thing about Richard Wright. For all his business acumen, for all his strategic brilliance that built Wright Enterprises into a Fortune 500 company, he never paid attention to what was right in front of him. He never noticed that while he was flying to Tokyo and London and Dubai, I was quietly building something of my own. And now he was about to find out just how much he had underestimated. Eleanor Wright. It was the 3rd Saturday in May, always marked in red on the family calendar. Our annual Wright Family Foundation Gala. For 40 years, I'd overseen every detail of this event, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the perfectly timed 4-course meal. The gala had grown from a modest dinner for 20 of Richard's colleagues to the social event of the season for Chicago's elite. This year, we expected over 300 guests, with proceeds benefiting children's literacy programs, a cause I'd championed since before Daniel was born. That morning, I woke at 5 as usual, though Richard's side of the bed was already empty. "Early meeting," his text had said the night before. It wasn't unusual. Richard had always been married to his work first, to me second. I'd accepted that. Bargain long ago. I slipped on my robe and headed downstairs, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the heating system. May in Chicago still carried a chill. In the kitchen, I prepared coffee, strong for Richard in his thermos, lighter for me in my favorite blue ceramic mug. I'd set out his daily vitamins beside a bowl of fresh berries and Greek yogurt. He probably wouldn't eat them. He rarely did. But for 40 years, I'd continued the ritual, as if one day he might notice. The kitchen in our lakeside home was my domain. Custom cherry cabinets, marble countertops, and a 6-burner gas range that had been my one indulgence when we'd renovated. 5 years ago, through the bay window, I could see the garden where my spring bulbs had already pushed through the soil, determined and resilient. Like me, I sometimes thought. At 6, I called Daniel as I did every Saturday morning, my ritual with my only child. He answered on the 4th ring, voice still thick with sleep. "Mom, it's early," he mumbled. I could hear Olivia shifting beside him, probably annoyed at the intrusion. "I know, sweetheart. Just checking about tonight. Your father's expecting you both at the head table. We'll be there, 7 sharp, black tie, I know the drill." There was a pause, then, "Is there anything else? Olivia and I have brunch with her parents at 11. I swallowed the familiar disappointment. "No, that's all. Have a nice brunch." After we hung up, I sat with my cooling coffee, scrolling through my to-do list for the gala. The florist would arrive at 2, the caterers at 3, the string quartet at 5:30, Everything precisely timed, perfectly orchestrated. The way Richard liked things. The way I'd learned to provide them. At 9, I left for my weekly hair appointment with Jerome, who'd been coloring my ash blonde hair for 20 years, keeping the silver at bay. "The usual, Mrs. Wright?" he asked, draping the black cape around my shoulders. "Actually, Jerome," I said, surprising myself, "I'm thinking something different today." His eyebrows shot up. "Different? You've had the same elegant bob since I can remember." "Maybe something shorter? More modern?" Jerome studied my reflection, head tilted. "You know what? I have just the thing. Trust me?" I nodded, suddenly excited by the small rebellion. By noon, I emerged with a chic, sophisticated cut that took years off my appearance. I felt lighter somehow, both physically and emotionally. My next stop was Georgina's boutique, where my gown for the evening waited. I'd selected it months ago, a midnight blue sheath with delicate beading that caught the light when I moved. Classic, appropriate, exactly what was expected of Richard Wright's wife. "Ellie, you look fabulous!" Georgina exclaimed when I walked in. "Your hair! It's magnificent!" "Thank you," I said, feeling a flush of pleasure at the genuine compliment. "Just needed a change." Georgina squeezed my hand. "Change is good. Now, about this dress. I had a thought." She disappeared into the back room and returned with something entirely unexpected. A deep emerald gown with a daring neckline and an open back. "Georgina, I couldn't possibly—" "Try it," she insisted. 40 years of hosting this gala, always in navy or black. This is your year to shine. 30 minutes later, I left with the emerald dress, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. By the time I returned home, the florist's vans were already parked in the circular driveway. I directed them to the arrangement areas I'd marked throughout. The house, the timing precise, the placement exact. Everything flowing like a well-rehearsed ballet. Years of practice had made me efficient, if not always visible. At 4:30, with everything in place, I went upstairs to prepare. The emerald dress hung on my closet door, both accusation and invitation. I showered and applied my makeup with extra care, highlighting my hazel eyes with smoky shadow, adding a deeper shade of lipstick than my usual pale pink. When I finally stepped into the dress, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She looked confident, striking even. Not at all like Richard Wright's appropriate wife. The thought gave me a strange satisfaction. The doorbell rang at 6:15. Richard was never late for events, especially his own. I took one final look in the mirror, squared my shoulders, and descended the grand staircase. Richard stood in the foyer, checking his watch. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then, his brow furrowed. Slightly. "Ellie," he said, his tone somewhere between question and accusation. "That's not the dress we discussed. Not, you look beautiful. Not, that color is stunning on you. Just a notation of deviation from the plan." "I decided on something different," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He checked his watch again. "It's too late to change now. The photographer will be here in 10 minutes for the family portrait." I wasn't planning to change, Richard. He finally looked at me properly, eyes narrowing slightly as they took in my new haircut, the unfamiliar makeup, the daring dress. "Is everything all right? You seem—" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Not yourself." Before I could answer, the door opened, and Daniel walked in with Olivia on his arm. My son was the perfect blend of Richard and me, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but with my softer features and kinder eyes. Olivia was sleek in a designer black dress, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. "Wow, Mom," Daniel said, genuinely surprised. "You look amazing." "Doesn't she?" came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Grace entering through the kitchen door, elegant as always in her signature red. My oldest friend had been by my side since college, before Richard, before Wright Enterprises, before I became Mrs. Richard Wright instead of Eleanor Campbell, the art history major with dreams of her own. The caterers needed guidance on the seafood display, Grace explained, then lowered her voice as she embraced me. "You look absolutely radiant." Richard cleared his throat. "We should take our places. The guests will be arriving soon." And just like that, the moment of being seen was over. The gala proceeded as it always did. Perfectly orchestrated, elegantly executed. I moved among the guests, remembering names, spouses, children's accomplishments, making everyone feel welcomed and valued. This had always been my role, the warm counterpoint to Richard's more strategic networking. From across the room, I caught glimpses of my husband throughout the evening. His tall frame bent attentively toward the university president, laughing with the mayor, deep in conversation, with the CEO of a tech company Richard had been courting for partnership. He was in his element, commanding and charismatic. It was during one such scan of the room that I noticed her. Vanessa Parker, Richard's executive assistant, looking stunning in a form-fitting red dress that matched her bold lipstick. She wasn't usually invited to the family gala. Staff attended the company holiday party, not our private foundation events. Yet there she was, leaning close to Richard, touching his arm as she whispered something that made him throw his head back in laughter. I'd never seen him laugh that freely at any of my observations. "She's been by his side all evening," Grace murmured, suddenly beside me. "I thought you should know." I kept my smile fixed in place, years of practice making it automatic. "She's his assistant. It's her job to support him." Grace's eyes held mine. "Ellie, I've seen how he looks at her, and I've seen how she looks at him. It's not professional." "Richard wouldn't," I said automatically, though even as the words left my mouth, 1,000 small details suddenly rearranged themselves in my mind. The late meetings, the weekend trips where I was no longer invited to accompany him, the way he'd stopped sharing details of his day, the decreased intimacy that I'd attributed to age and familiarity. "Mrs. Wright?" A waiter appeared at my elbow. "Mr. Wright is ready to begin his speech. He's asking for you to join him at the podium." "Thank you," I said, smoothing my emerald dress. "Please tell my husband I'll be right there." I made my way to the stage where Richard waited with an impatient expression. As I approached, I saw Vanessa straightening his tie, her red fingernails in stark contrast to his white shirt. She stepped back as I arrived, but not before I caught the intimacy in her touch, the possessiveness. "There you are," Richard said, offering his arm mechanically. "Ready?" For 40 years, I'd stood beside Richard at these events. For 40 years, I'd smiled while he thanked everyone except me for the success of the evening, for the success of our life together. For 40 years, I'd accepted being invisible. Tonight, something was different. Perhaps it was the emerald dress. Perhaps it was Grace's confirmation of what I'd refused to see. Perhaps it was simply that 40 years was enough. As Richard led me to the podium, I noticed Daniel watching us, his expression troubled. Beside him, Olivia was engrossed in her phone, undoubtedly documenting the evening for her social media followers. At the next table, I spotted Richard's brother Edward with his third wife, both already flushed from too much champagne. The room was filled with people who'd been in our lives for decades, yet how many really knew me? Richard tapped the microphone, silencing the room. "Good evening, friends and colleagues. Thank you for joining us for the 40th Annual Wright Family Foundation Gala." Applause rippled through the crowd. Richard raised his hand in acknowledgement. "When I started this foundation 4 decades ago, I had a vision of creating meaningful change in our community. He continued with practiced charm, outlining accomplishments and future goals, all centered around his vision, his generosity, his legacy. I stood beside him, the perfect corporate wife, smiling and nodding at all the right moments. But inside, something was crumbling. Or perhaps, something was finally breaking free. And of course, Richard was saying, approaching the conclusion of his speech, none of this would be possible without the support of my dedicated team at Wright Enterprises. His gaze drifted to Vanessa, who smiled back with unconcealed adoration. The room suddenly felt too warm, the lights too bright. I'd like to especially thank Vanessa Parker, whose tireless work has been instrumental in expanding our foundation's reach this year. Polite applause followed as Vanessa gave a modest wave. I felt Grace's eyes on me from across the room, her expression a mixture of concern and indignation. And finally, Richard continued, turning slightly toward me with the practiced gesture he'd perfected over years of public appearances. I want to thank my wife Ellie for her assistance with tonight's arrangements. Assistance. As if I were one of the catering staff. As if I hadn't conceptualized this entire foundation, researched the beneficiaries, cultivated the donors, managed every detail of 40 galas while he took the credit. The room applauded dutifully. Daniel caught my eye, his expression apologetic. He knew. My son knew how his father diminished me, yet he'd never challenged it, never defended me. Richard raised his champagne glass. To another successful year of the Wright legacy. The crowd echoed his toast, glasses tinkling. Richard's hand rested lightly on my back, guiding me from the podium. A gesture that once felt protective but now seemed merely proprietary. As we stepped from the stage, Vanessa approached with 2 fresh glasses of champagne. She handed one to Richard, their fingers brushing longer than necessary. Brilliant speech as always, Mr. Wright, she purred. Thank you, Vanessa. Couldn't have done it without you, he replied, his voice warm with an affection I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I stood there, suddenly invisible again despite the emerald dress, despite my presence at my own event. Something inside me shifted decisively, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. Ms. Parker, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. I don't believe we've formally met. I'm Eleanor Wright. Vanessa's smile flickered, perhaps catching the steel beneath my pleasant tone. Of course, Mrs. Wright. It's an honor to finally meet you. Richard speaks of you often. Does he? I replied, holding her gaze. How interesting. He's never mentioned you at all. Richard stiffened beside me. Ellie, Vanessa has been my executive assistant for 3 years now. 3 years? I echoed, maintaining my smile. My, how time flies when you're not being introduced to your husband's staff. Vanessa's composure faltered. Richard's jaw tightened, the subtle warning sign I'd learned to heed years ago. Perhaps you've had enough champagne, dear, he murmured, attempting to guide me away. I stood my ground. Actually, I haven't had nearly enough, Richard. If you'll excuse me, I believe I'll get another. I turned to Vanessa. Lovely dress, by the way. Red suits you. Though perhaps a bit bold for a staff member at a charity event, don't you think? I walked away before either could respond, feeling Richard's glare burning into my back. For the first time in our married life, I had publicly deviated from the script. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Grace intercepted. Me at the bar, concern etched on her face. Are you all right? No, I said honestly, but I think I'm about to be. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical conversations. Throughout it all, I observed Richard and Vanessa, their carefully maintained distance that nevertheless couldn't disguise the current running between them, the private glances, the unnecessary touches disguised as professional interactions. By the time the last guest departed, it was past midnight. The catering staff moved efficiently through the house, restoring order, invisible workers like I had been for so long. Richard had disappeared into his study with Daniel for their traditional post-event scotch, a ritual I'd never been invited to join. I was directing the cleanup of the floral arrangements when Olivia approached, her expression softening for perhaps the first time that evening. "The gala was beautiful, Ellie," she said, using my first name as she always did, despite my gentle corrections early in her relationship with Daniel. "Everyone was talking about how stunning you looked tonight." "Thank you, Olivia." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Listen, about Vanessa." My heart skipped. "Yes?" "Daniel doesn't think I should say anything, but I thought you should know." She glanced around, ensuring we were alone. "Richard's been staying at the Peninsula Hotel 3 nights a week for the past month. The nights he tells you he's working late." The Peninsula, the most expensive hotel in Chicago, just blocks from Richard's office. Perfect for clandestine meetings that required more privacy than his corporate suite could offer. "How do you know this?" I asked, surprisingly calm despite the confirmation of my suspicions. "My college roommate works in guest relations there. She mentioned seeing him regularly." Olivia paused. "With a younger woman." I nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "Thank you for telling me." Olivia looked uncomfortable, perhaps regretting her moment of honesty. "I should find Daniel. We need to head out soon." As she walked away, I remained still, absorbing this final piece of evidence. I'd suspected, of course, but suspicion was different from knowledge. Knowledge required action. I made my way upstairs to our bedroom, the house now quiet except for the murmur of voices from Richard's study. In our ensuite bathroom, I carefully removed my makeup, studying my reflection. The woman who stared back at me was neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor plain. She was simply unseen. For 40 years. I changed from the emerald dress into silk pajamas, folding the gown carefully before placing it on the chaise lounge. Then I did something I'd never done before. I locked our bedroom door from the inside. When Richard tried the handle 30 minutes later, I was already in bed, though nowhere near sleep. "Ellie?" he called, jiggling the handle. "Why is the door locked?" "I'm tired, Richard. We'll talk tomorrow." A pause, then. "Is this about tonight? About Vanessa?" "She's a valuable employee, Ellie. Nothing more." The lie hung in the air between us, even through the solid oak door. "Good night, Richard." I heard him sigh. Then his footsteps retreated down the hall toward one of the guest rooms. It wasn't the first time he'd slept elsewhere in the house, but it was the first time I'd been the one to make that choice. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, remembering the ambitious young man who'd swept me off my feet in my final year of college. Remembering the early years of our marriage, when we'd lived in a tiny apartment and dreamed of success together. Remembering the birth of Daniel, and how Richard had held my hand through 15 hours of labor, then returned to work the next morning for an unmissable meeting. Remembering how, year by year, I'd made myself smaller to accommodate his growing success. How I'd set aside my own ambitions to support his. How I'd convinced myself that being Mrs. Richard Wright was enough of an identity. But underlying these familiar reflections was something new, a current of anger I'd never allowed myself to feel. And beneath that anger was something even more dangerous, a plan that had been forming for longer than I'd realized. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the day I finally opened the lockbox in my closet, the one Richard had never noticed, containing papers he'd never bothered to read. Tomorrow would be the day Eleanor Wright stopped being invisible. As dawn broke over Lake Michigan, casting golden light across our bedroom, I made a silent promise to myself. This would be the last sunrise I would greet as the dutiful Mrs. Richard Wright. It was time to become Eleanor again. Morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains as I opened my eyes, momentarily disoriented by the silence. Usually, Richard would be up by now, the shower running, his electric razor humming. The events of the previous night came flooding back, The emerald dress, Vanessa's possessive touch on my husband's arm, the locked bedroom door. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. 7 missed calls from my sister Maggie. A text message. From Grace. Call me when you're up. Worried about you. Nothing from Richard. The house was eerily quiet as I made my way downstairs in my silk robe. The cleaning staff had done their usual impeccable job. No trace remained of last night's gala. Every crystal vase back in its place, every surface gleaming, as if nothing had happened. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. In the kitchen, I found a note propped against the coffee maker in Richard's decisive handwriting. Early meeting downtown. Don't wait up tonight. No mention of our confrontation, no acknowledgement of the locked door, no apology for his behavior. Just business as usual. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash, then set about making coffee. As I waited for it to brew, I looked around the kitchen I'd designed with such care. The hand-painted Italian tiles I'd sourced from a tiny shop in Florence, the copper pots hanging above the island, each one a souvenir from cooking classes I'd taken around the world. Everything in this house bore my touch, yet nothing truly felt like mine. With coffee in hand, I walked to the sunroom that overlooked the garden. The May morning was bright but cool, the lake visible in the distance beyond our manicured property. I sat in my favorite wicker chair and finally returned Maggie's calls. "Ellie, thank God," my sister answered immediately. "I've been trying to reach you since last night. Thomas and I left the gala early, his back was acting up, but I saw what happened with Richard and that woman." "Vanessa," I supplied, my voice surprisingly steady. "His executive assistant." "Executive assistant, my foot," Maggie scoffed. The way she was looking at him, I wanted to knock that smug smile right off her face. I smiled despite myself. Maggie had always been the fighter between us, quick to anger, quick to defend. 5 years in the army before she'd met Thomas had only sharpened her protective instincts. "It wasn't just looks," I said quietly. "Olivia told me he's been staying at the peninsula 3 nights a week. With her." Maggie fell silent, which for my outspoken sister was more telling than any curse or condemnation. "How long have you known?" she finally asked. "Suspected? Months, maybe longer. Known for certain?" "Since last night." "What are you going to do?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, considering. "I'm not sure yet." "Come stay with us in Denver," Maggie urged. "You shouldn't be alone right now." "I'm not alone, Maggie. I'm actually by myself for the first time in 40 years. There's a difference." After promising to keep her updated, I ended the call and immediately dialed Grace. She answered on the first ring. "I'm on my way over," she said without preamble. "Have you eaten? I'm bringing bagels." 30 minutes later, Grace arrived. With not only bagels but also a folder tucked under her arm. We settled in the sunroom, the morning sunlight now warming the space. "I wasn't sure if you'd want these," she said, sliding the folder across the table toward me. "But I thought you should have them." Inside were photographs, discreetly captured images from the gala showing Richard and Vanessa in various moments of unmistakable intimacy, a hand lingering too long on a back, heads bent close in conversation, a shared laugh that excluded everyone else. "How did you get these?" I asked, though I already knew. Grace's husband had been a photojournalist before his death 5 years ago. She'd learned his techniques well. "I had a feeling," she said simply. "I've watched him with her at the last few events, the company Christmas party, the March of Dimes fundraiser. It's been building for months." I studied the photos, feeling strangely detached. You know what bothers me most? Not that he found someone else. It's that he thought I wouldn't notice. After 40 years, he still doesn't see me as someone capable of observation or action. Grace reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "So what will you do?" I closed the folder and set it aside. First, I'm going to eat this bagel. Then I'm going to open a lockbox that's been gathering dust for 15 years. And after that? I took a deep breath. After that, I'm going to have a very different kind of conversation with my husband. After Grace left, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, a space that suddenly felt foreign, as if I were walking through a museum exhibit of someone else's life. The king-sized bed with its custom duvet, the matching nightstands with their precisely aligned reading lamps, the framed photographs chronicling our life together, our wedding day, Daniel's birth, family vacations, charity events, each image carefully selected to convey the perfect right family narrative. I entered my walk-in closet, half the size of Richard's, of course, and pushed aside the winter coats I hadn't yet stored for the season. Behind them, nearly invisible against the cream-colored wall, was a small door leading to an alcove I'd insisted on during the renovation. Richard had thought it a waste of space. "What do you need a reading nook in your closet for?" he'd asked dismissively. I'd claimed it was for quiet moments with a book, away from household staff and social obligations. He'd never once checked to see if I actually used it that way. I pressed on the recessed panel, and the door swung open silently. Inside, the alcove was exactly as I'd left it 6 months ago. The small armchair, the battery-operated reading lamp, and most importantly, the antique secretary desk that had belonged to my grandmother. The desk Richard had wanted to donate when we'd moved to Lakeside, claiming it didn't match our more sophisticated decor. I sat in the chair and ran, my fingers along the desk's smooth surface, remembering my grandmother's hands doing the same. A pang of longing for her wisdom struck me. Margaret Eleanor Campbell had been widowed at 45 when my grandfather's heart gave out suddenly one autumn afternoon. Instead of crumbling, she'd built a new life for herself, returning to school for a business degree and turning my grandfather's struggling hardware store into a regional chain that she eventually sold for a comfortable sum. "Never put all your eggs in one basket, Ellie," she'd told me repeatedly, "and never let a man, even one you love, control all the eggs." I'd remembered her words on my 30th birthday, when she'd gifted me this desk along with a substantial check. "For you," she'd emphasized, her blue eyes sharp despite her 80 years. "Not for Richard, not for the household, not for Daniel's education, for whatever makes you feel secure in this world." Richard had been annoyed when I'd deposited the money in a separate account under my maiden name. "It seems unnecessarily complicated," he'd complained. "Just put it in our joint account. I'll have my finance team invest it properly." For once, I'd stood firm. "It was a gift to me, Richard, from my grandmother. I'll manage it myself." He'd eventually dropped the matter, assuming I'd spent the money on frivolous things, spa days or jewelry or designer clothes. He'd never asked, and I'd never volunteered the information. He had his secrets, and I had mine. I reached beneath the desk and pressed the hidden lever that released the false bottom of the top drawer. Inside lay a burgundy leather portfolio that hadn't seen daylight in nearly a decade. I lifted it out with trembling hands and opened it on my lap. Inside were the documents that charted the quiet rebellion I'd been waging for years. Bank statements from Campbell Holdings LLC, a company Richard didn't know existed. Investment reports from the portfolio my grandmother's money had established, now grown to over 10 times its original value through careful management and the guidance of my brother-in-law Thomas, who'd never breathed a word of it to Richard during their golf games. Most significantly, there was the deed to a property on the Oregon coast, a modest but beautiful cottage overlooking the Pacific that I'd purchased 12 years ago, when Richard had dismissed my suggestion that we buy a vacation home there. "Who wants to spend time in the dreary Pacific Northwest?" he'd scoffed. "If we're going to have a second home, it'll be somewhere prestigious, Palm Beach or Aspen." We'd ended up with neither, as Richard was always too busy for extended vacations. But I had made time, twice a year, for wellness retreats with Grace, weeks that were actually spent maintaining and enjoying my secret sanctuary. The cottage was fully paid for, titled under Campbell Holdings LLC. Richard had never questioned the retreats, had probably been grateful for the uninterrupted time they'd given him with his various assistants over the years. Vanessa was likely just the latest in a line that stretched back further than I cared to contemplate. I continued through the portfolio, reviewing each document with the careful attention I'd always given to Richard's social calendar. The last section contained the most dangerous papers, drafts of divorce proceedings I'd had prepared 5 years ago, when I'd first suspected Richard of infidelity with his previous assistant. I'd ultimately set them aside when that woman had left the company suddenly. Now I understood why. Richard simply moved on to the next available admirer, like a bee visiting different flowers in the same garden. The documents would need updating, of course. But the framework was there, meticulously outlined by a divorce attorney in Portland who had no connections to Chicago's business elite. An attorney Richard couldn't intimidate or buy off. I closed the portfolio, my heart racing but my mind clearer than it had been in months, perhaps years. I returned everything to its hidden compartment and locked the desk, then exited the alcove, securing the concealed door behind me. Back in the bedroom, I showered and dressed with unusual care, selecting a tailored burgundy suit I usually reserved for board meetings of the literacy foundation I chaired. The color reminded me of the portfolio, of power and possibility. I applied makeup that accentuated rather than diminished my features and fastened my grandmother's pearls around my neck. Not the ostentatious diamonds Richard had given me for our 35th anniversary, jewels meant to reflect his success, but the simple strand that represented the strength of the Campbell women. As I descended the stairs, my phone chimed. With a text from Daniel. Heading to Dad's office for lunch. Need anything downtown? I hesitated only briefly before responding. Actually, I'd like to join you. Can you make it reservation for 3 at Gibson's? 1 p.m.? 3 dots appeared immediately, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally. Sure, Mom. Everything okay? Perfect, I replied. See you then. Gibson's Steakhouse was Richard's favorite restaurant, an old-school Chicago institution where he was treated like royalty and had a standing corner table. It was where he took important clients, where deals were made over rare steaks and expensive scotch. It was not where he expected to see his wife on a Sunday afternoon. I arrived precisely at 12:55, giving the maître d' my name and watching his momentary confusion. Mrs. Wright, we weren't expecting you today. Mr. Wright's usual table is ready, of course. Thank you, Henri, I replied with a warm smile. My son should be arriving shortly. I was seated and had just ordered a martini, Richard's preferred drink, not the white wine I usually sipped, when Daniel arrived, looking handsome but slightly harried in casual weekend attire. Mom, he greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. This is a surprise. You never come to Dad's power lunches. Things change, I said simply. How was brunch with Olivia's parents? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Fine, the usual. Her father talked investments, her mother talked about the neighbor's divorce. He glanced around. Dad's running late? Is he? I checked my watch. How inconsiderate. Let's order appetizers while we wait. Daniel studied me with growing curiosity as I confidently ordered Richard's favorite starters and another martini. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Questions about my unusual assertiveness, my unexpected appearance at a restaurant I typically avoided, my second drink before Richard had even arrived. Mom, he finally said, leaning forward. What's going on? You seem different. I set down my glass and met my son's gaze. Daniel, when was the last time you and I had a real conversation? Not about the weather, not about Olivia's latest charity project, but about something that matters? He blinked, taken aback. I'm not sure. That's because it's been years, I said gently. You talked to your father about business and investments. You talked to Olivia about your social calendar, but you and we exchanged pleasantries. Nothing more. That's not true, he protested, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. It is true. And I've allowed it because that's what I've always done. Stepped aside to make room for Richard Wright and his priorities. But I'm done with that. Now, Daniel's eyes widened. What are you saying? I'm saying that your father is having an affair with his executive assistant. I'm saying that he's been staying at the Peninsula Hotel with her 3 nights a week while telling me he's working late. I'm saying that after 40 years of marriage, he didn't even have the decency to be discreet about it at our own foundation gala. The color drained from Daniel's face. Mom, did you know? I asked quietly. He looked down at his hands. I suspected. I didn't want to believe it. And you said nothing. What was I supposed to say? He's my father. You're my mother. I didn't want to get in the middle. There is no middle, Daniel. There's right and there's wrong. I took a sip of my martini, letting the sharp bite of the gin steady me. But that's not why I wanted to have lunch with you today. I wanted to tell you myself, before your father creates his own narrative. I'm leaving him. Daniel's shock was evident, but before he could respond, Richard appeared at the table, his confident stride faltering only slightly when he saw me. Ellie, he said, his tone carefully modulated. This is a surprise. I thought Daniel and I were having our usual father-son lunch. Change of plans, I replied pleasantly. I thought it was time for a family discussion. Richard's eyes darted. Between Daniel and me, assessing the situation with the same tactical precision he applied to business negotiations. He adjusted quickly, sliding into his chair and signaling to the waiter. Scotch, neat, Macallan 25. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table as Richard received his drink. He took a measured sip, then set the glass down deliberately. So, he said with forced casualness, what's this family discussion about? I glanced at Daniel, whose expression had shifted from shock to a strange mixture of discomfort and... Was that respect? He gave me a slight nod and I turned back to Richard. I know about Vanessa, I said simply. I know about the peninsula. I know this isn't the first time. Richard's face remained impressively impassive, the same expression he wore during tough negotiations. I don't know what you think you know, Ellie, but this is hardly the place. It's exactly the place, I interrupted. Your favorite restaurant, your territory. I thought you'd appreciate the professional setting for what is essentially a business discussion at this point. His eyes narrowed. A business discussion? About what exactly? About the terms of our divorce. Daniel made a small, strangled sound but remained silent. Richard's mask slipped momentarily, surprise flashing across his features before he regained control. Don't be ridiculous, he said dismissively. We're not getting divorced over a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, Dad, Daniel said quietly. I saw you with her too. Everyone did. Richard's head snapped toward our son, a flash of betrayal in his eyes. This doesn't concern you, Daniel. Actually, it does, I countered. He's our son. Your behavior affects him too. Richard leaned forward, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. After everything I've given you, the lifestyle, the social position, the foundation with your name on it, this is how you repay me? By ambushing me in public? By turning my son against me? I felt a strange calm wash over me, the calm that comes with absolute clarity. The foundation doesn't have my name on it, Richard. It's the Wright family foundation. I've never had an identity in this marriage beyond being Mrs. Richard Wright. And as for what you've given me, I took a slow sip of my martini. You've given me 40 years of watching you take credit for my work. 40 years of shrinking myself to fit in the corner of your life. 40 years of looking the other way while you chased younger women. Daniel flinched, but I continued, my voice steady. I'm not asking for anything now. I'm telling you how things will proceed. I've already consulted an attorney. I'll be moving out of the house immediately. You'll be hearing from my lawyer regarding the division of assets." Richard's face darkened with a familiar anger, but for once, I didn't flinch away from it. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk away from 40 years with some dramatic announcement in the middle of my restaurant? Where do you think you'll go? What do you think you'll live on? You've never worked a day in your life." A flash of pain crossed Daniel's face at his father's cruelty, but I merely smiled. "That's where you're wrong, Richard. I've worked every day of the last 40 years. I've run your household, raised your son, managed your social calendar, hosted your business dinners, organized your charity events, and built your reputation as a family man. The fact that you never paid me doesn't mean I wasn't working." I set my empty glass down with a decisive clink. "As for where I'll go and what I'll live on, that's no longer your concern." Richard's laugh was cutting. "You think you can afford the lifestyle you've become accustomed to on whatever settlement you get? Don't be naive, Ellie. My lawyers will ensure you get exactly what's fair. No more, no less." "I'm counting on that," I replied with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have places to be." I stood, smoothing my burgundy suit. Daniel half rose as well, his expression conflicted. "Daniel," Richard said sharply, "sit down. We need to discuss this rationally without your mother's theatrical exit." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, who now stood at a crossroads between the father he'd emulated and the mother he'd overlooked. "Daniel is an adult," I said. "He can make his own decisions about who he sits with." With that, I turned and walked away, feeling Richard's glare boring into my back. I didn't allow myself to look back to see what Daniel had chosen. That was his journey now, not mine. Outside in the bright May sunshine, I took a deep breath, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. I'd done it. After 40 years of accommodation and silence, I'd finally spoken my truth. The relief was dizzying. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of the Four Seasons. My overnight bag was already in the trunk of my car, packed discreetly while Richard was in his study the night before. I'd made the hotel reservation from my closet alcove, using the credit card Richard didn't know existed. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, my phone lit up with incoming calls. Richard, then Daniel, then Richard again. I silenced it and dropped it into my purse. Whatever they had to say could wait. For the first time in decades, I had more important things to attend to than Richard Wright's demands or feelings. The Four Seasons doorman greeted me with professional courtesy, signaling for assistance with my modest luggage. In the elegant lobby, I approached the reception desk with the confident bearing I'd observed in Richard countless times. "Good afternoon," I said to the young woman behind the counter. "I have a reservation under Campbell, Eleanor Campbell." The sound of my maiden name on my lips was strange and wonderful, like reconnecting with an old friend. The receptionist tapped at her computer, then smiled warmly. "Yes, Ms. Campbell. We have you in a Lakeview suite for 3 nights. May I see your identification and credit card?" As I completed the check-in process, I felt a presence at my elbow. Turning, I found Daniel standing there, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "Mom," he said simply, "I couldn't let you leave like that." Something soft and warm bloomed in my chest. "What about your father?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He started talking about damage control and how we needed to manage the situation, as if you were a PR problem, not his wife of 40 years. He shook his head. I told him I had to go. The receptionist discreetly slid my room key across the counter. I thanked her and turned back to my son. "Would you like to come up? We could order room service, talk properly." He nodded, relief evident in his face. I'd like that. In the elevator, Daniel finally asked the question I'd been expecting. "What happens now?" I considered my answer carefully. Now I figure out who Eleanor Campbell is after 40 years of being Mrs. Richard Wright. Are you really going through with the divorce? The elevator doors opened onto a plush corridor. I stepped out before answering, waiting until we were walking side by side toward my suite. Yes, I am. Your father made his choice. Now I'm making mine. But where will you go? What will you do? I smiled at the echo of Richard's questions, though Daniel's tone held genuine concern rather than contempt. I have plans, Daniel. I've had them for longer than you might think. Inside the suite, the expansive windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, the water glittering under the afternoon sun. I set my purse down and turned to my son, really seeing him, not just as Richard Wright's heir or the little boy I'd raised, but as the man he'd become. There was uncertainty in his eyes, but also a dawning respect that I realized had been missing for years. I want to show you something, I said, retrieving my phone. I opened the photo gallery and scrolled to an album labeled Oregon. Inside were dozens of images of a charming cottage perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, sunset views from the back deck, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a sunlit kitchen with open shelving displaying mismatched pottery. Daniel scrolled through the photos, confusion evident on his face. Is this a vacation rental or something? No, I said softly. It's mine. I bought it 12 years ago. His head snapped up. What? How? Dad never mentioned. Your father doesn't know about it. It's purchased through a holding company under my maiden name. Daniel stared at me as if seeing a stranger. You've had a secret house for 12 years? How did you afford it? I took a deep breath. This was the moment of true revelation, not just to Daniel, but in many ways to myself. My grandmother left me money when I turned 30. Richard wanted me to put it in our joint account. I didn't. Instead, I invested it, created a limited liability company, and purchased assets that Richard couldn't touch. The Oregon property is just one of them. Daniel sank onto the sofa, visibly processing this information. So all those wellness retreats with Grace were spent at my cottage, yes. And Dad never suspected? I laughed softly. Your father sees what he expects to see. He expected a decorative wife who managed his social calendar and didn't ask questions. That's what he saw. Until yesterday, Daniel murmured. Until yesterday, I agreed. So what happens now? You'll move to Oregon? I sat beside him on the sofa, suddenly feeling lighter than I had in years. Eventually, yes. But first, I need to finalize the divorce. Settle matters here in Chicago. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then, I want to see it. Your cottage. I'd like that, I said, surprised by the emotion that thickened my voice. Very much. Just not right away. I need time to process all this. Dad's going to be... He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of Richard that my heart twisted. Your father is going to be angry. I finished for him. Probably for a long time. He doesn't like losing control of anything, especially things he considers his possessions. And that's how he sees you? As a possession? I considered the question, trying to be fair despite my anger. I think he sees me as a role, not a person. Mrs. Richard Wright. And as long as I played that role perfectly, he was satisfied. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I should have noticed. All these years I should have seen how he treated you. You were raised in it, Daniel. It was normal to you. I touched his shoulder gently. But you have a chance to be different. With Olivia, with your future children. You have a chance to see the women in your life as full people, not supporting characters in your story. He looked up, his eyes suddenly older. I don't want to be like him. Then don't be, I said simply. We ordered room service and talked for hours. Really talked, for perhaps the first time since he'd left for college. He shared his doubts about following Richard into the business, his concerns about Olivia's growing obsession with social status, his desire for a simpler life than the one he was living. I listened, not as Richard Wright's wife or even as Daniel's mother, but as Eleanor Campbell, a woman with her own mind and her own perspective. As evening fell and the lake darkened outside the windows, Daniel finally prepared to leave. "But the door," he hesitated. "He'll try to contact you, you know. Once the shock wears off, he'll try to convince you to come back." "I know," I replied. "He doesn't like losing anything he considers his. What will you say?" I smiled, feeling the power of my own certainty. "I'll tell him what I should have said years ago, that I deserve to be more than an accessory to someone else's life." After Daniel left, I stood at the window watching the city lights flicker on across the darkening landscape. My phone had accumulated 37 missed calls and dozens of texts. From Richard, from country club acquaintances, from foundation board members. News traveled fast in our circle. I turned the phone off completely and ran a hot bath in the luxurious marble tub. As I soaked, I allowed myself to fully feel the tumult of emotions I'd been managing all day. The hurt, the anger, the fear, but also the exhilaration, the relief, the sense of possibility. Tomorrow would bring challenges, no doubt. Richard wouldn't surrender his control easily. There would be attempts at manipulation, at intimidation, perhaps even at reconciliation. The social circle we'd inhabited would fracture into those who sided with him and the few brave souls who might stand with me. But for tonight, in this quiet hotel room high above the city where I'd spent my entire married life, I was finally free. Free to dream of ocean waves instead of lake shores. Free to imagine a life where I answered to no one but myself. Free to become, at last, the woman I might have been all along. Eleanor Campbell was awakening after 40 years of slumber, and she had plans that Richard Wright couldn't begin to imagine. The morning sun streamed through the hotel curtains I'd forgotten to close. For a moment, I lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, my mind searching for familiar reference points. Then reality rushed back. The gala, the confrontation at Gibson's, the night in this hotel room that marked the first time in 40 years I'd slept truly alone by choice. I stretched, surprised by the absence of the usual stiffness in my shoulders, tension I'd carried for so long I'd stopped noticing it. My phone remained off, a small act of rebellion that felt surprisingly significant. For decades, I'd been instantly available to respond to Richard's needs, Daniel's questions, the Foundation's emergencies. Today, the world could wait. The room service menu beckoned. I ordered coffee and something I'd never allowed myself at. Belgian waffles with strawberries and whipped cream, a breakfast Richard would have deemed unnecessarily indulgent. The small rebellion tasted like freedom. As I savored each bite, I mentally outlined the day ahead. My first priority was securing legal representation. Not Richard's corporate attorneys who handled our estate planning, but someone solely dedicated to my interests. My second task was retrieving essential documents from the house while Richard was at work. Then I needed to contact the Oregon property management company that maintained my cottage and begin preparations for an extended stay. After breakfast, I finally turned on my phone, bracing for the deluge. 52 missed calls, 87 text messages, 39 emails, the digital manifestation of a life imploding. I bypassed them all and dialed Grace. "Thank God," she answered immediately. "The whole North Shore is ablaze with gossip. Richard's telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown at Gibson's. Are you okay?" "Better than okay," I assured her. "I'm at the Four Seasons. I need your help with a few things today." "Name it." "I need to get into the house while Richard's at work. There are documents in my closet alcove that I can't leave behind." "I'll pick you up at 11, Grace said without hesitation. Richard always has his Monday executive meeting until at least 2. My next call was to Sophia Chen, a razor-sharp attorney I'd met through the Literacy Foundation. She'd recently handled a complex divorce for another foundation board member, navigating it with discretion and remarkable effectiveness. Her client had walked away with far more than her husband's. Aggressive attorneys had initially offered. "Eleanor," Sophia greeted me warmly, "this is unexpected." "I need to discuss a personal legal matter," I said, keeping my voice steady. "A divorce." A brief pause, then, "I have an opening at 1 today. Would that work?" "Perfectly." With my immediate plans secured, I finally began sorting through messages. Most were from shocked acquaintances fishing for gossip, thinly veiled beneath expressions of concern. I ignored those. Several were from foundation board members, worried about the gala fundraising tallies and upcoming events. Those could wait. 10 messages were from Richard, their tone evolving from irritated, "This dramatic exit is beneath you," to commanding, "Come home immediately," to falsely conciliatory, "We need to discuss this like adults." The latest, sent at 3 a.m., was more revealing. The Chicago community won't look kindly on a wife abandoning her husband after he gave her everything. Think about what you're throwing away. I deleted each message without responding. Daniel had texted just once. "Thinking of you. Call if you need anything." That one I answered. "Having breakfast at the Four Seasons. Meeting with an attorney at 1 Gao. I'm okay." His response came immediately. "Dad's on the warpath. Careful if you go to the house." A chill ran through me. Richard's anger had always been cold and calculating rather than explosive, but I'd seen what happened to business associates who crossed him. He didn't yell or threaten. He systematically dismantled their defenses, isolated them from potential allies, then struck when they were most vulnerable. I'd been witnessing his strategies for 40 years. Now they would be directed at me. At 11, Grace texted from the hotel's front entrance. I grabbed my purse and the room key, suddenly nervous about returning to the house that had been my domain for so long. Grace's sleek silver Audi was idling at the curb. She looked impeccable as always in a tailored pantsuit, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob that framed her determined face. "You look good," she remarked as I slid into the passenger seat. "Better than I expected." "I feel good," I admitted. "Terrified, but good." "Richard called me last night," she said as she pulled into traffic. "Wanted to know if I knew where you were." My stomach tightened. "What did you tell him?" "That if he hadn't noticed you were unhappy after 40 years of marriage, he shouldn't expect me to explain you to him now." I laughed, a genuine laugh. That felt foreign in my throat. I wish I could have seen his face. "It wasn't pretty," Grace said with grim satisfaction. "He's calling everyone, you know, spinning the story." Poor Richard, blindsided by his irrational wife's midlife crisis. "I'm 65, I pointed out. A bit late for a midlife crisis." That's what I told the Hendersons when they called fishing for details. The drive to Lakeside was filled with Grace's updates on the social fallout. Most of our acquaintances were cautiously siding with Richard, their own marriages built on similar unspoken agreements. A few, mostly women who'd been through their own divorces, had reached out to Grace expressing quiet support for me. Beverly Michaels said, and I quote, "It's about damn time Eleanor stood up for herself," Grace reported, "and she's been friends with Richard since college." As we pulled into the long, curving driveway of the Wright estate, I felt a curious detachment. The imposing colonial facade, the manicured gardens, the gleaming windows, all of it seemed to belong to someone else's life now. "His car's gone," Grace noted, pulling around to the service entrance at the side of the house. "Let's be quick. Anyway." I used my key to enter through the mudroom. The house was quiet, the cleaning staff not due until Wednesday. Everything was exactly as I'd left it 2 days earlier. Dishes neatly stacked in the cabinet, fresh flowers in the crystal. Vase on the entry table. Richard's Wall Street Journal folded precisely on the kitchen counter. Yet everything felt different. I moved through the space like a visitor in a museum, noting details I'd selected or arranged, but feeling no attachment to them. "You okay?" Grace asked, watching me closely. I nodded. "It just doesn't feel like mine anymore." "It never was," she said gently. "It was always his house that you maintained." The simple truth of her observation struck me forcefully. Even the decisions I'd thought were mine, paint colors, furniture arrangements, decorative touches, had all been made within parameters Richard had established. The entire house was a showcase for his success, not a reflection of my identity. "Let's get what you came for," Grace suggested. "I'll keep watch downstairs." I climbed the curved staircase quickly, heading straight for my closet alcove. The house felt charged somehow, as if Richard's anger lingered in the air despite his absence. I worked efficiently, retrieving my grandmother's leather portfolio from its hiding place and gathering a few additional items I hadn't packed in my overnight bag. My grandmother's pearls, some favorite books, the small watercolor my mother had painted of our Wisconsin farmhouse. As I was zipping these treasures into a small duffel bag, I heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door opening. My heart lurched. Richard wasn't supposed to be home for hours. "Ellie, Grace is urgent," whisper carried up the stairs. "He's back." I froze momentarily, then forced myself to move. Closing the alcove door silently, I grabbed the duffel bag and hurried to the bedroom door. I could hear Richard's heavy footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of car keys being tossed onto the counter. Grace appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her expression tense. "Back door," she mouthed, pointing toward the rear staircase that led to the garden entrance. I nodded and turned toward the back hallway, but it was too late. Richard's voice boomed from below. "I know you're here, Ellie. Your friend's car is in the driveway." Grace's face hardened. She stepped forward, positioning herself in the center of the foyer. "She's just collecting some personal items, Richard. Then we'll be on our way." I moved to the top of the main staircase, clutching the duffel bag like a shield. Richard stood in the entryway, still wearing his executive armor, tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, power tie. But his normally immaculate appearance was subtly disheveled. His hair wasn't perfectly combed, his tie was slightly askew. Most tellingly, the controlled mask he always wore in public had slipped, revealing something I rarely saw: uncertainty. "Ellie," he said, his voice softening as he spotted me. "Come downstairs. We need to talk." "I'm just collecting a few things," I replied, descended halfway down the staircase but maintaining distance between us. "I'll be out of your way shortly." "This is ridiculous," he said, an edge creeping back into his voice. "You're acting like a stranger. This is your home." "Is it?" I countered quietly. "Or is it just the house where I've lived while managing your life?" His jaw tightened. 40 years of marriage, and this is how you choose to end it? By ambushing me in public, embarrassing me in front of our son, then sneaking into our house. Like a thief? "I used my key," I pointed out, "to collect my personal possessions. Hardly the actions of a thief." "Personal possessions?" he scoffed. "Everything in this house was purchased with my money. My success built this life for us." "Our success," I corrected him. "I contributed every day for 40 years. The fact that my contribution didn't come with a paycheck doesn't make it less valuable." Richard's face flushed with anger. "So, that's what this tantrum is about? Money? You think you're entitled to half of everything I've built because you organized dinner parties and redecorated the guest room every few years?" Grace made a sound of outrage, but I held up a hand to stop her intervention. I descended the remaining stairs until I stood on even ground with him, no longer looking up from a position of lesser height. "This tantrum, as you call it, is about dignity," I said evenly. "It's about recognizing that I've spent 40 years being Mrs. Richard Wright instead of Eleanor Campbell. It's about finally acknowledging that your multiple affairs weren't momentary indiscretions, but a pattern of disrespect. I took a breath, steadying myself. And it's about deciding that at 65, I still have time to live as myself, not as your accessory. Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite guilt, perhaps regret. Then it was gone, replaced by the calculating look I knew so well. "You won't get half," he said coldly. "My legal team will make sure of that. The prenup we signed? When I was 24 and you were 26? I interrupted. "The one that predates most of your wealth and all of the current estate laws? I'm not concerned about it." His eyes narrowed. "You've already spoken to a lawyer." "I have an appointment this afternoon," I confirmed. "Not with your corporate attorneys who have always prioritized your interests, but with independent counsel who will represent me exclusively." Richard's facade cracked further. He hadn't expected this level of preparation. In his mind, I was still the agreeable young woman who had signed whatever he placed in front of her, who had accepted his explanations without question. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his tone shifting to the persuasive one he used in difficult negotiations. "Vanessa was. An error in judgment. But throwing away 40 years of marriage over one indiscretion is extreme, don't you think?" "One indiscretion?" I echoed incredulously. "Richard, please. There was Jessica before Vanessa, and Michelle before Jessica. Probably others I never discovered. This isn't about one affair. It's about a lifetime of being unseen and undervalued." He stepped closer, lowering his voice confidentially, as if Grace weren't standing right there. "What do you want, Ellie? A bigger allowance? More involvement in the foundation? Your name on the letterhead? We can arrange all that. There's no need for lawyers and public spectacle." The sad thing was, a week ago I might have considered his offer. I might have accepted these token concessions as meaningful change, but not anymore. "What I want," I said clearly, "is a divorce. A fair division of assets, and the freedom to live the remainder of my life on my own terms." Richard's expression hardened, the brief vulnerability vanishing. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice cold. "When the excitement of your rebellion fades, you'll realize what you've thrown away. The position in Chicago society, the comfort of our life together, the respect that comes with being Mrs. Richard Wright." I smiled sadly. "That's where you're wrong. I don't want to be Mrs. Anybody. I want to be Eleanor Campbell again." He recoiled slightly, as if I'd struck him. In a way I had. His identity was so thoroughly wrapped up in his achievements, his possessions, including me, that my rejection of his name felt like the ultimate betrayal. "We'll see how well Eleanor Campbell manages without Richard Wright's resources," he said bitterly. "Don't come crawling back when you discover that a 65-year-old housewife with no resume and no recent work experience isn't exactly in high demand." Grace stepped forward, eyes flashing. "That's enough, Richard. We're leaving now." "This doesn't concern you, Grace," he snapped. "When you insult my best friend in front of me, it absolutely concerns me," she retorted. "And for the record, Eleanor has more strength and capability in her little finger than you have in your entire inflated ego. She'll be just fine without you." I squeezed Grace's arm gratefully, then looked Richard in the eye one last time. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours regarding the division of property. In the meantime, I trust you won't dispose of any marital assets or attempt to restrict my access to our joint accounts." His expression confirmed that was exactly what he'd been planning. "Everything will remain as it is until our legal teams can meet," he said stiffly. I nodded, knowing it was a lie. "Goodbye, Richard." As Grace and I walked toward the side door, Richard called after me, his voice carrying a note I rarely heard from him: desperation. "What am I supposed to tell people?" "The foundation gala is in 3 weeks. The Hendersons' anniversary party is this weekend." I turned, struck by the absurdity of his concerns. After 4 decades together, facing the end of our marriage, his primary worry was maintaining social appearances. "Tell them whatever you want," I replied. "I'm sure you'll craft a narrative that preserves your dignity. You always do." Grace's car felt like a sanctuary as we pulled away from the house. Through the passenger window, I could see Richard standing in the doorway, watching us leave. He looked strangely diminished against the grand facade of the home he'd built as a monument to his success. "Are you okay?" Grace asked as we turned onto the main road. I considered the question seriously. "Yes," I said finally. "I think I am." "He'll freeze the accounts, you know. Probably already has. Men like Richard always do." I patted my duffel bag, where my grandmother's portfolio rested securely. "Let him. I have resources he doesn't know about." Grace shot me a curious glance. "You never cease to amaze me, Eleanor Campbell." The name sounded right, felt right, like slipping into a comfortable garment I'd set aside long ago and rediscovered in the back of a closet. "I've been planning this longer than you might think," I admitted. Not consciously, perhaps. But somewhere deep inside, I've been preparing for years. "Smart woman," Grace approved. "Where to now? We have 2 hours before your appointment with Sophia." I considered my options. Lunch, I decided. Somewhere Richard would never go, somewhere casual and unpretentious. Grace grinned. "I know. Just the place." 20 minutes later, we were seated at a weathered wooden table in a tiny Greek restaurant in Evanston, far from Richard's usual downtown haunts. The owner, a heavy-set man with a booming laugh, greeted Grace with the warmth of a longtime customer. The menu was handwritten, the plates mismatched, and the food simple but extraordinary. As we shared dolmades and Greek salad, I found myself laughing more freely than I had in years. Without the weight of Richard's expectations, his preference for French cuisine, his distaste for eating with one's hands, his insistence on maintaining a certain image even during private meals, I felt lighter, more present. "So what happens next?" Grace asked as we sipped strong Greek coffee from small, handleless cups. "After your meeting with Sophia?" I traced the rim of my cup thoughtfully. "I need to tie up loose ends here, make sure the divorce proceedings are properly initiated. Then I'm thinking of spending some time at my cottage in Oregon." "The place Richard doesn't know about," Grace said with a hint of mischief. "Exactly. He's going to be blindsided when he discovers you have independent resources," she observed. "Men like Richard always underestimate women like us." "That's been his biggest mistake," I agreed. "He's never really seen me, not the real me." At precisely 1 p.m., we arrived at Sophia Chen's office in a sleek downtown high-rise. The reception area was elegantly understated. Soft gray walls, comfortable seating, discreet lighting that flattered every complexion. Unlike the ostentatious marble and glass lobbies of Richard's preferred legal firms, Sophia's space invited confidence rather than intimidation. Grace squeezed my hand. "Want me to wait?" I shook my head. "This might take a while. I'll call you when I'm finished." "Mrs. Wright?" The receptionist approached with a professional smile. "Ms. Chen is ready for you." I straightened my shoulders. "Actually, it's Ms. Campbell now. Eleanor Campbell." The receptionist nodded without missing a beat. "Of course, Ms. Campbell. Right this way." Sophia Chen's office matched her reputation. Precise, elegant, and unapologetically feminine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Lake Michigan, while shelves displayed both legal tomes and carefully chosen art pieces. Sophia herself rose from behind a glass desk as I entered, extending her hand with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her analytical eyes. "Eleanor," she greeted me. "Please, sit down." I settled into a comfortable chair across from her, placing my duffel bag beside me. "I understand you're seeking representation for a divorce," Sophia began, her tone professionally neutral. "Before we discuss specifics, I should disclose that my firm has never represented Wright Enterprises or Richard Wright personally, so there's no conflict of interest. However, given your husband's prominence in Chicago, I want to ensure you're comfortable with my representing you despite our previous foundation connection. That's precisely why I chose you, I replied. You understand the social dynamics involved, but your loyalty isn't compromised by business relationships with Richard. Sophia nodded, seemingly satisfied. Then let's begin. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, which means marital property is divided fairly, but not necessarily equally. Given the length of your marriage and your role in maintaining the household and supporting your husband's career, you would typically be entitled to a substantial settlement. Typically, I echoed, but Richard will fight it. Most high-net-worth individuals do, Sophia agreed, especially those with significant ego investment in their wealth. You mentioned a prenuptial agreement on the phone? I nodded. Signed? In 1982, before Richard's company went public. Before most of our current assets were acquired. Sophia made a note. That's potentially helpful. Older prenups are often vulnerable to challenge, especially if there's been a substantial change in circumstances since signing. She looked up. Has Richard been the sole breadwinner throughout your marriage? In terms of formal employment, yes. But I've managed the household, raised our son, organized business events in our home, represented the family at social and charitable functions, and essentially served as the unpaid CEO of the Wright family brand. Sophia's smile was approving. Good. That's exactly how we'll frame your contribution. Now, what about assets? Do you have an estimate of your marital worth? I reached into my duffel bag and removed my grandmother's portfolio. This contains an overview of our joint assets based on last year's tax returns. The house in Lakeside is worth approximately $4. $2 million. Richard's stock in Wright Enterprises is valued at around $30 million. There are investment properties. In Palm Beach and Aspen, artwork, vehicles, and various investment accounts. Sophia's eyebrows rose slightly as she began reviewing the documents. This is remarkably thorough, Eleanor. I've been the one signing the tax returns for 20 years, I explained. Richard was always too busy to review the details. He just trusted me to handle it. A small smile played at Sophia's lips. His oversight may work in our favor. She continued scanning the documents, then looked up with a more serious expression. Richard will likely try to restrict your access to joint accounts immediately. Do you have independent financial resources to sustain you during the proceedings? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The revelation that would set this divorce apart from the usual script. I removed a second set of documents from the portfolio and placed them on Sophia's desk. I have approximately $8 million in investment accounts under my maiden name, held through Campbell Holdings, LLC. The accounts are at Northern Trust, completely separate from our family banking relationships. Additionally, I own a property in coastal Oregon valued at approximately $900,000, also held by the LLC. Sophia's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing genuine surprise. These assets were acquired during your marriage? The initial investment came from an inheritance from my grandmother when I was 30. I invested it independently and added to it over the years with small amounts I set aside from household accounts. And Richard is unaware of these assets? Completely. The accounts are in my maiden name. The LLC is registered in Oregon, and all correspondence has been directed to a P.O. box that Grace checks for me. Sophia leaned back in her chair, studying me with new appreciation. Well, Eleanor Campbell, you've just considerably strengthened your position. Richard will be preparing to fight a financially dependent spouse. He won't be expecting an opponent with independent resources and 40 years of detailed knowledge of his business affairs. I've lived with Richard long enough to understand how he operates, I said. He'll try to overwhelm me with legal maneuvers, drain my resources with prolonged proceedings, and intimidate me into accepting less than I deserve. With these independent assets, we can withstand those tactics, Sophia noted, shuffling through the papers. Though I'm curious, Why initiate divorce proceedings now, after 40 years? I considered the question, wanting to give an honest answer. I've spent my entire adult life supporting Richard's ambitions, maintaining his home, raising his son, and preserving his social standing. I did it willingly, believing we were partners and building something meaningful together. But at the gala this weekend, watching him publicly acknowledge his assistant while dismissing my contributions, something finally broke. I met Sophia's gaze directly. I realized I could spend my remaining years continuing to shrink myself, to fit in his shadow, or I could reclaim whatever time I have left to live as myself. Sophia nodded, no longer the calculating attorney, but simply one woman understanding another. My grandmother had a saying, "Better to be an autumn flower than never to bloom at all." Exactly, I said softly. I may be in the autumn of my life, but I'm not dead yet. There's still time to bloom. The remainder of our meeting was focused on strategy. Sophia outlined the legal process ahead, filing the petition, financial discovery, potential mediation, and if necessary, trial. She recommended securing my personal items and documents immediately, which I'd already done. She also advised documenting any existing marital assets before Richard could begin concealing them. "I'll have the initial paperwork ready for your signature tomorrow," she said as our meeting concluded. "Once filed, Richard will have 30 days to respond. Given what you've told me about him, he'll likely instruct his attorneys to contest everything and drag out the process. He'll also try to damage my reputation," I warned. "Richard has significant influence in Chicago. He won't hesitate to use it against me." "Let him try," Sophia said with quiet confidence. "Every attack he makes only strengthens our narrative about the type of man you're leaving." As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, Sophia asked one final question. "Where will you stay now? The Four Seasons is lovely but expensive. For an extended period." "I'm considering options," I replied. "I have friends who've offered guest rooms, but I'd prefer maintaining my independence." "I know a discreet apartment building in Lincoln Park owned by a former client," Sophia offered. "Furnished units, month-to-month leases, excellent security. Many of the residents are women in transition, some from marriages, some from other life changes." "That sounds perfect," I said gratefully. "I'll make a call," Sophia promised. "And, Eleanor, you've already done the hardest part, deciding to prioritize yourself after a lifetime of putting someone else first. Everything else is just paperwork." As I left Sophia's office and stepped onto the bustling downtown sidewalk, I felt a curious mixture of emotions. Anxiety about the battle ahead, lingering sadness for the death of a 4-decade marriage, but predominantly, a growing sense of possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Mom, Dad's lawyers called. They're filing emergency motions to freeze all the accounts. Are you okay financially?" I smiled to myself as I typed my response. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine. Having dinner with Grace tonight. I'll call you tomorrow." Another message appeared, from Richard this time. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Ellie. My legal team is already preparing motions that will leave you without resources while we sort this mess out. Be reasonable and come home. We can still fix this." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to the man who still believed he held all the power in our relationship. The man who had no idea that while he'd been building his empire, I'd quietly been constructing a lifeboat. Instead, I hailed a taxi and directed the driver to take me back to the Four Seasons. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, finding temporary housing, responding to Richard's legal maneuvers, weathering the social storm that was undoubtedly brewing. But today, in this moment, I was simply Eleanor Campbell, no longer invisible, no longer silent, and finally, after 40 years, no longer afraid. The Lakewood residence, an elegant pre-war building in Lincoln Park with discreet security and spacious apartments, became my home for the next phase of my life. My temporary apartment on the 8th floor featured high ceilings, hardwood floors, and windows overlooking the lush green park. The furnishings were tasteful if impersonal, but after decades of living surrounded by items chosen to reflect Richard's status rather than my preferences, the neutrality felt refreshing. Within days of filing the divorce petition, Richard's response materialized exactly as Sophia had predicted. His legal team, 4 attorneys from Chicago's most prestigious firm, filed emergency motions to freeze all marital assets, claiming I had abandoned the marriage and might dissipate resources. They demanded immediate return of all right. Family heirlooms, including jewelry Richard had given me over the years. Most aggressively, they petitioned for exclusive occupancy of the lakeside house, arguing that as the primary breadwinner, Richard needed the home office to maintain the family's financial stability. Sophia received these motions with the calm of a chess master watching a predictable opening move. "Standard intimidation tactics," she explained during our morning meeting in her office. "They're hoping to destabilize you emotionally and financially, forcing you to accept an unfavorable settlement." "Will they succeed?" I asked, noting how the morning sunlight highlighted the steel gray in Sophia's meticulously styled hair. She smiled, tapping her pen against the stack of Richard's legal filings. "They might have if you were the woman Richard believes you to be. Financially dependent and easily intimidated," I supplied. "Exactly. His entire strategy hinges on controlling access to money, knowing that most divorcing spouses in your position would be paralyzed without it." Sophia set down her pen and leaned forward. "But he doesn't know about Campbell Holdings or your independent resources. His first surprise will come when we don't immediately petition for temporary support." "He'll think I'm being stubborn," I said, understanding the psychological chess match unfolding. "Initially, yes. Then he'll assume you have a wealthy friend or family member supporting you." Sophia's smile turned slightly predatory. "When we eventually reveal your independent assets during discovery, it will fundamentally destabilize his narrative and his strategy. So we wait? We respond to his motions with factual corrections but don't show our hand yet. Meanwhile, we gather information." She slid a thick folder across the desk. "Our financial forensics team needs you to review these records. Flag any large transfers, unusual expenses, or patterns that might indicate hidden assets." The folder contained hundreds of pages of bank statements, investment reports, and credit card bills spanning the past 5 years, a task Richard would have dismissed as administrative minutiae beneath his attention. "I'll start today," I promised, oddly energized by the challenge. As I left Sophia's office, my phone chimed with a text from Daniel. "Having lunch with Dad? At the university club at 1. He's in attack mode. Forewarned." I smiled at my son's loyalty, appreciating his discreet updates on Richard's movements and mindset. Daniel had been navigating the treacherous waters between us with remarkable grace, refusing to take sides publicly while privately ensuring I wasn't blindsided by his father's maneuvers. Back at the Lakewood, I settled at the small dining table, with Sophia's folder and my laptop. Hours passed as I methodically reviewed 5 years of our financial life, noting patterns invisible to anyone who hadn't managed the right household accounts for decades. Richard's spending had changed subtly about 3 years ago. Monthly charges at high-end hotels appeared, initially explainable as business expenses, but showing a pattern that aligned suspiciously with Vanessa's hiring. Jewelry purchases from Tiffany emerged around Valentine's Day and Christmas, items I'd never received. Most tellingly, a pattern of cash withdrawals appeared every Friday, $2,000 weekly from an account I rarely monitored. By evening, I had compiled a detailed spreadsheet documenting over $400,000 in questionable expenses that couldn't be attributed to household needs, business requirements, or gifts I'd received. When I emailed the analysis to Sophia, her response was immediate. "Outstanding work. This will be extremely useful. Can you come in tomorrow at 9? The next morning, Sophia greeted me with newfound respect. Your financial forensics are impressive, she said, gesturing to my spreadsheet displayed on her computer screen. You've identified patterns our team might have missed without intimate knowledge of your household expenses. Richard always said I had an eye for detail, I replied, though he meant it as criticism, not compliment. His underestimation of you continues to work in our favor, Sophia noted. Based on your analysis, we have grounds to argue that Richard has already dissipated marital assets for non-marital purposes. The affairs, I said, the truth still pinching despite my emotional distance. Precisely. In Illinois, financial misconduct during marriage can affect property division. Sophia opened a different file on her computer. Now, for our next challenge. Richard has scheduled a meeting with foundation donors tomorrow evening at the Chicago Club. His assistant, Vanessa, has sent invitations claiming the event will clarify leadership structure moving forward. My stomach tightened. The Wright Family Foundation had been my primary focus for decades. While Richard had provided the initial funding and served as the public face, I had selected the literacy programs we supported, cultivated relationships with community partners, and managed the volunteer network that implemented our initiatives. He's making his move to push me out, I realized aloud. Yes, but without proper board approval. The foundation bylaws, which I've reviewed, require a board vote to remove any founding director. Sophia handed me a printed document. You and Richard are both listed as founding directors with equal voting rights. I skimmed the bylaws, memories surfacing of the foundation's creation. Richard had wanted to name himself as sole director, but our attorney at the time, a woman nearing retirement who had nothing to lose by contradicting him, had insisted on equal status for both spouses. Richard had eventually conceded, assuming it was a meaningless formality since I would naturally follow his lead. So legally, he can't unilaterally remove me, I concluded. Correct. Moreover, since the foundation's focus on literacy was your initiative, and you've managed the programmatic side for 40 years, we can argue that your removal would materially harm the foundation's mission. What's our next step? Sophia's expression turned strategic. We attend the meeting. Richard. We'll be furious, I warned. Precisely the point. When he reacts inappropriately in front of donors, it strengthens our position. Sophia closed her laptop decisively. Wear something professional, but striking. Preferably not navy or black. Those are Richard's power colors. You want to appear distinct from him, not complimentary. That evening, as I was reviewing more financial documents, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Cautiously, I answered. Eleanor Campbell? A woman's voice inquired. Yes, speaking. This is Margaret Winters, from the Lakeside Literary Guild. The name was familiar. She chaired the community organization that partnered with our foundation to implement adult literacy programs in underserved neighborhoods. I hope I'm not overstepping, but I wanted to reach out personally about tomorrow's foundation meeting. You're not overstepping at all, Margaret, I assured her. What can I help with? Well, the invitation we received was unusual. It mentioned clarifying leadership structure and was signed by Richard's assistant, not you. Several board members found it concerning, especially given the rumors circulating about your personal situation. So the divorce gossip had reached the literacy community. I chose my words carefully, aware that Margaret could be either ally or unwitting spy for Richard. The foundation is undergoing some transitions, I acknowledged, but our commitment to literacy programs remains unchanged. That's precisely what worries us, Margaret continued. You've been our primary contact and champion for years. Richard has always been, let's say, more interested in the financial aspects than the programmatic ones. If you're being sidelined, we're concerned about the foundation's future direction. Her candor surprised me. I appreciate your directness, Margaret. I'll be attending tomorrow's meeting. Perhaps we could speak privately afterward. I'd like that, she agreed, sounding relieved. And Eleanor? Many of us remember who actually shows up at the reading circles and volunteer trainings. It's not Richard. After we disconnected, I sat absorbing the implications of this unexpected support. Richard had always claimed that his name and financial contributions were what gave the foundation its prestige. Yet Margaret's call suggested that at least some community partners valued my less visible but more consistent involvement. For the first time, I wondered if Richard's narrative about our respective contributions might not be universally accepted. The next evening, I arrived at the Chicago Club 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. I had chosen a deep burgundy suit that I'd purchased for a foundation event the previous year, but had never worn, fearing Richard would consider it too bold. My grandmother's pearls completed the outfit, a subtle reminder of the Campbell strength I was reclaiming. The club's mahogany-paneled reception room was already half full with foundation donors and community partners. Heads turned as I entered, conversations pausing momentarily before resuming with increased intensity. I caught fragments of whispered exchanges. Filed for divorce. Affair with the assistant. 40 years of marriage. I moved through the room with practiced social grace, greeting longtime donors and partners with warm handshakes and genuine inquiries about their families. Many responded with surprised delight, having clearly expected my absence. Margaret Winters approached immediately, clasping my hand in both of hers. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you're here," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "We were just discussing the success of the Reading Mentor program you initiated last year. The outcome data is remarkable." I recognized her strategic support and squeezed her hand gratefully. The mentors deserve all the credit. I merely connected the right people. "Don't undervalue your contribution," Margaret insisted. "Your ability to build those connections is what makes the program work." Other literacy partners joined our circle, each emphasizing projects I'd spearheaded or relationships I'd cultivated. Their support was pointed, but not overt. Professional appreciation rather than personal allegiance in the divorce drama. I was deep in conversation about expanding the mentor program when Richard arrived, Vanessa trailing discreetly behind him. He faltered momentarily upon seeing me surrounded by key foundation partners, his confident stride hitching before resuming with forced assurance. "Eleanor," he greeted me with manufactured pleasantness. "I wasn't expecting you this evening. As founding director, I wouldn't miss an important foundation meeting," I replied with equal cordiality, noting the flicker of frustration in his eyes. Richard recovered quickly, shifting into his public persona. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on such short notice. Shall we move to the conference room?" The assembled guests followed Richard through the club's ornate corridors to a wood-paneled meeting room dominated by a massive table. Vanessa stationed herself near the head of the table, distributing folders with the Right Foundation logo. I noted with interest that my name had been removed from the materials. As guests took their seats, Richard naturally assumed the head position. I chose a seat midway down the table, not challenging his authority directly, but not relegating myself to the sidelines either. "Thank you all for making time for this important discussion," Richard began with practiced charm. "As you know, the Wright Foundation has been a cornerstone of Chicago's literacy efforts for 4 decades. During that time, we've maintained a consistent vision and leadership structure." He paused, scanning the room. "Recent personal changes necessitate some organizational adjustments to ensure continued stability. Moving forward, I will be assuming sole directorship of the foundation, with Vanessa Parker taking on an expanded role as executive director." Murmurs rippled through the room. Margaret Winters caught my eye, one eyebrow raised in silent question. I gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Mr. Wright," Margaret said, raising her hand slightly. "While we all appreciate your leadership, many of us have worked primarily with Eleanor on programmatic initiatives. Will she remain involved in some capacity?" Richard's smile tightened. Eleanor's participation will naturally diminish as she focuses on her personal priorities. The subtle emphasis conveyed his narrative. I had chosen to withdraw from foundation responsibilities. Actually, I interjected calmly, as founding director with equal standing per the foundation bylaws, I remain fully committed to our literacy mission and partnerships. The tension in the room crystallized as donors and partners glanced between us, sensing the power struggle beneath our polite exchanges. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Perhaps I wasn't clear. Given the circumstances, centralized leadership is essential for foundation stability. What circumstances would necessitate removing the director who has managed our community partnerships and program development for 40 years? I asked, maintaining a tone of professional inquiry rather than personal confrontation. Richard's composure slipped slightly. The dissolution of our marriage creates obvious complications for shared leadership. Many organizations function effectively with divorced co-founders, I pointed out. Our personal situation need not impact the foundation's operations, particularly since we've always had divided responsibilities, you focusing on financial oversight while I managed program implementation. Several donors nodded in agreement. Edward Thompson, our longest-standing financial supporter, cleared his throat. If I may, Richard, the Foundation's dual leadership has always been one of its strengths. Eleanor's programmatic expertise complements your financial acumen. Disrupting that balance seems potentially detrimental to the mission. Richard hadn't anticipated this resistance. His expression hardened as he realized the narrative he'd constructed, the abandoned husband nobly maintaining the charitable work while his wife pursued selfish interests, wasn't being universally accepted. While I appreciate your perspective, Edward, Richard replied, his voice taking on the steely tone I recognized from countless business confrontations, the reality is that shared leadership between estranged spouses is impractical and inefficient. That depends entirely on the spouses in question, I countered evenly. I see no reason why our professional responsibilities should be compromised by personal matters. Unless, of course, there are other motivations for this restructuring. The implied question hung in the air. Was Richard's attempt to remove me from the foundation genuinely about organizational efficiency, or was it punitive, another attempt to diminish my identity and contribution? Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside Richard, her presence suddenly conspicuous. Several donors exchanged meaningful glances, the unspoken narrative of the affair adding an uncomfortable subtext to Richard's leadership claims. Richard recognized his tactical error too late. By bringing foundation partners into what should have been a private reorganization, he'd created witnesses to our power struggle and given me a platform to demonstrate my continued commitment to the mission. Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves, Richard conceded, attempting to regain control of the meeting. Today's discussion was meant to be preliminary, an opportunity to hear thoughts about potential restructuring options. An excellent point, I agreed smoothly. Any significant changes to foundation leadership should involve thorough consultation with our partners and formal board approval. For today, perhaps we should focus on upcoming programs and funding priorities. With that pivot, I effectively redirected the meeting toward substantive foundation business, positioning myself as the reasonable party interested in mission advancement rather than power struggles. For the next hour, I facilitated discussion about literacy initiatives, deferring to Richard on financial matters while demonstrating intimate knowledge of program operations. By the meeting's end, Richard's attempt to sideline me had backfired spectacularly. Instead of witnessing my graceful exit from foundation leadership, donors and partners had seen me actively engaged, knowledgeable, and committed, while Richard appeared increasingly tense and defensive. As attendees gathered their materials and began filtering out, Margaret Winters approached me. "That was illuminating," she murmured. "Several donors are questioning Richard's narrative about your withdrawal from foundation activities." "I have no intention of abandoning the literacy work," I assured her quietly. It's too important. Good, Margaret replied firmly. Because while Richard may have provided the funding, you've been the heart of the foundation's impact. We all know that. From across the room, I could feel Richard's gaze boring into me as he observed our exchange. When the last guest had departed, leaving only Richard, Vanessa, and me in the elegant conference room, he finally dropped his public mask. That was an impressive performance, Ellie, he said coldly. Undermining me in front of our major donors. I simply corrected misconceptions about my continued role, I replied, gathering my notes. The undermining was entirely your doing, Richard, attempting to remove me without board approval or proper process. This is exactly why divorced couples can't run foundations together, he snapped. The inevitable power struggles damage the organization's reputation. There wouldn't be power struggles if you weren't attempting to erase my 40 years of contribution, I pointed out. I have no interest in challenging your financial oversight or public role. I simply won't be pushed out of the work I've built. Vanessa, visibly uncomfortable with the confrontation, murmured something about waiting in the car and quickly exited. Her departure left Richard and me truly alone for the first time since the confrontation at our house. Why are you doing this? Richard demanded, his voice lower but intensity undiminished. You've made your point with the divorce. Why drag the foundation into our personal issues? The question revealed so much about his perspective. His assumption that my foundation work was merely an extension of my wifely duties rather than a meaningful contribution in its own right. That I would naturally relinquish it, along with the marriage, as if my identity existed only in relation to him. The foundation isn't a bargaining chip in our divorce, Richard. It's 40 years of my professional life, my relationships with community partners, my programmatic vision. I won't surrender that identity simply because our marriage has ended. His expression shifted subtly, frustration tinged with genuine confusion. Even now, he couldn't quite grasp that I had carved out a professional identity independent of being Mrs. Richard Wright. This isn't just about the foundation, he said after a moment. You're living somewhere I can't find. You've hired that shark Chen as your attorney. You haven't touched the emergency credit card I left accessible. His eyes narrowed. Where are you getting money, Ellie? The question I'd been waiting for. I kept my expression neutral. I'm managing, Richard. That's all you need to know at this point. Maggie, he concluded with sudden certainty. Your sister's bankrolling this rebellion, isn't she? Thomas always was irresponsibly generous. I neither confirmed nor denied his assumption, letting him believe what he wished about my financial support. My arrangements are my business now, Richard, just as yours are yours. His jaw tightened. You realize I could make this divorce extremely difficult, drag it out for years. The emotional toll alone would affect us both, I interrupted. To what end, Richard? Punishing me for wanting an identity beyond Mrs. Wright? For refusing to overlook affairs that you barely bothered to conceal? What exactly are you fighting for? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What was he fighting for? Not the marriage itself. He'd already replaced me emotionally with Vanessa and perhaps others before her. Not my companionship. He'd increasingly spent evenings at the office rather than at home. Perhaps it was simply the facade, the perfect, right family image he'd cultivated so carefully over 4 decades. I'm fighting for what's right, he said finally, for 40 years of building something together that you're now willing to destroy over wounded pride. Is that truly how you see it? I asked, genuinely curious. That I'm destroying something rather than finally creating something for myself? Richard gathered his briefcase, his movements precise and controlled despite his evident frustration. You'll regret this path, Ellie. When the emotional satisfaction of your independence fades, you'll find yourself alone, without the position, the respect, the security I provided. Perhaps, I acknowledged. but I'd rather risk regret than continue living as an appendage to someone else's life. He paused at the door, turning back with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between anger and genuine bewilderment. I gave you everything, Ellie. Everything. Except the one thing I needed most, I replied softly. Recognition, as a full partner in our life, not just the support staff. After he left, I remained seated in the empty conference room, processing the encounter. Richard's confusion about my financial independence was telling. He genuinely couldn't imagine me functioning without his resources. His assumption that Maggie must be supporting me revealed the limits of his perception. In 40 years of marriage, he had never truly seen me as capable of independent action or strategic thinking. That blind spot would be his undoing in the divorce proceedings. The following morning, I met with Sophia to review the foundation confrontation. She listened intently to my account, occasionally making notes. He played directly into our hands, she observed when I'd finished. By attempting to remove you publicly, he created witnesses to his retaliatory intent. Several of those donors may prove valuable witnesses if we need to demonstrate his pattern of diminishing your contributions. Margaret Winters has already offered her support, I confirmed. She's prepared to document my leadership of program initiatives if necessary. Excellent. Sophia tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. Now, about Richard's growing suspicion regarding your financial independence. Our timeline is accelerating. His legal team filed a discovery motion yesterday demanding complete financial disclosure. So they'll learn about Campbell Holdings? Yes, but on our terms. Sophia's smile held satisfaction. I've prepared our response, strategically revealing your independent assets while simultaneously filing our counter motion regarding Richard's dissipation of marital assets. She handed me a thick document with yellow signature tabs. This details the $400,000 in questionable expenses you identified, characterizing them as marital assets spent on extramarital affairs, a form of financial misconduct under Illinois law. Richard will be furious, I noted, feeling a strange mixture of apprehension and vindication. Precisely the reaction we want, Sophia confirmed. An angry Richard is an irrational Richard, and irrational opponents make strategic errors. As I signed the documents, a text notification appeared on my phone. Daniel. Dad called this morning, asking if I know where you're getting money. Says you must have stolen from joint accounts before leaving. What's happening? I showed Sophia the message. Richard's getting desperate, she observed. He expected financial leverage to force you back by now. I composed a careful response to Daniel. Your father is confused. I haven't touched joint accounts. We're entering financial discovery phase of divorce. All will become clear soon. Love you. Sophia watched me with thoughtful eyes. Daniel's position is difficult. Richard will increasingly pressure him to choose sides. Daniel is an adult with his own relationship with his father, I replied. I won't use him as a pawn in our divorce, even if Richard tries to. After leaving Sophia's office, I walked to a nearby coffee shop to meet Grace, who had been my emotional anchor throughout this turbulent period. She was already waiting at a corner table, 2 steaming mugs before her. You look tired, she observed as I sat down. Richard making trouble? Attempting to, I confirmed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. He tried to remove me from the foundation yesterday. That manipulative bastard, Grace muttered. Did he succeed? Quite the opposite. His heavy-handedness actually rallied support for my continued involvement. Grace's smile was fierce with approval. He never did. Understand that your quiet approach built more genuine loyalty than his financial bullying. He's also growing suspicious about my financial independence, I added. Keeps asking where I'm getting money since I haven't accessed joint accounts. Let him wonder, Grace said with satisfaction. The man has underestimated you for 40 years. It's about time he discovered who you really are. That's what scares me, I admitted, lowering my voice. When Richard feels cornered or surprised, he can be vindictive. Once he learns about Campbell Holdings and the Oregon property, he'll escalate. Grace reached across the table to squeeze my hand. You've survived 40 years of Richard Wright's controlled anger and manipulation. You can handle whatever he throws at you now. I hope you're right, I said, though a persistent worry gnawed at me. Richard had always been most dangerous when his carefully constructed image was threatened. And nothing threatened that image more than the revelation that his supposedly dependent wife had built a secret financial life right under his nose. That evening, as I returned to my temporary apartment, the building concierge stopped me. Ms. Campbell, these were delivered for you. He handed me an elaborate floral arrangement, white roses and lilies in a crystal vase I recognized from our home in Lakeside. The card read simply, 40 years deserves a conversation, not lawyers. Dinner tomorrow? Richard. I stared at the familiar handwriting, recognizing the tactical shift. Richard had moved from anger to apparent reconciliation, a strategy he'd employed in business negotiations countless times. When intimidation failed, he switched to charm. Setting the flowers on the entry table, I texted Sophia a photo with the message, Phase 2 begins. Her response was immediate. Classic manipulation. Flowers today, threats tomorrow if you don't respond as desired. Document everything. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone rang with Richard's number. After brief hesitation, I answered. The flowers are beautiful, Richard, I said by way of greeting, but unnecessary. 40 years of marriage deserves at least the courtesy of direct conversation, he replied, his voice carefully modulated to convey reasonable disappointment rather than anger. We've been communicating through lawyers and public confrontations. That's beneath us, Ellie. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But given recent events, I prefer maintaining professional boundaries. One dinner, he pressed, at Gibson's, neutral territory. No lawyers, no Vanessa, no tactics. Just two people who shared a life trying to find a civilized path forward. I considered his offer, weighing Sophia's likely advice against my own instincts. Richard was most dangerous when feeling cornered, true, but he was also most revealing when convinced he was regaining control. Thursday at 7, I decided. But Richard, this isn't a reconciliation. It's a conversation between soon-to-be former spouses. Of course, he agreed, a hint of satisfaction entering his voice. I'll make the reservation. After ending the call, I sat in the quiet apartment, contemplating the chess match unfolding between us. Richard believed he was making a strategic move, drawing me into direct negotiation where his personal influence could overcome legal formalities. He didn't realize I had my own reasons for accepting. In 2 days, our respective legal teams would exchange financial disclosures. By Thursday evening, Richard would know about Campbell Holdings, the Oregon property, and my 40 years of quiet financial planning. He would know that his primary leverage, financial control, had never been as absolute as he believed. Our dinner wouldn't be Richard's opportunity to charm me back into submission. It would be my chance to finally face him as equals. Eleanor. Campbell meeting Richard Wright across the negotiating table, neither subservient nor intimidated. The thought brought a smile to my lips as I turned out the light. For the first time in our 40-year relationship, I was genuinely looking forward to surprising Richard Wright. Gibson's Steakhouse hummed with Thursday evening energy as I arrived, precisely at 7. The maitre d' recognized me immediately, his professional composure slipping momentarily. Ms. Campbell, Mr. Wright is already seated. His correction of my name was small but significant, evidence that Richard had been outmaneuvered even in this minor detail. I had called Gibson's that morning and updated my preferred name in their system, ensuring I would be addressed as Eleanor. Campbell, not Mrs. Richard Wright. Thank you, Henry, I replied with a warm smile. Richard had secured his usual corner table, the power spot where Chicago's elite conducted their most important negotiations. He stood as I approached, his expression carefully calibrated to convey concerned civility rather than the cold anger I'd seen at the foundation meeting. Eleanor, he greeted me, using my full name rather than the diminutive Ellie he'd employed for 40 years. Another small signal that the relationship had fundamentally shifted. Richard, I responded, allowing the server to pull out my chair. You're looking well. He was, in fact, looking strained. The impeccable navy suit couldn't disguise the tension in his shoulders or the new lines around his eyes. The past 3 weeks had taken their toll on his carefully maintained appearance of control. I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of the Camus, Richard said as the sommelier approached with an open bottle of his preferred Cabernet. I remember it's your favorite. It wasn't, actually. I'd always preferred lighter Pinot Noirs to the bold Cabernets Richard favored, but I'd deferred to his palate for so long that he genuinely believed we shared the same preference. Thank you, I said simply, allowing the sommelier to pour a taste. The rich red wine coated my tongue with familiar notes of blackberry and cedar. Richard watched expectantly as I nodded approval. I appreciate you agreeing to meet, he began once the sommelier had departed. These past weeks have been unnecessary. Necessary for whom? I asked mildly, setting down my glass. Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. For either of us. This escalating legal battle, the foundation confrontation, the social spectacle, none of it serves our mutual interests. And what are our mutual interests, Richard? Dignity? Privacy? Financial security? He leaned forward slightly. Despite what you may believe, I don't want to see 40 years end in acrimony and public litigation. I studied him across the pristine white tablecloth, recognizing the negotiation strategy he'd employed countless times in business. Start with apparent reasonableness. Appeal to shared concerns. Position yourself as the practical voice seeking resolution rather than conflict. Your legal team's tactics suggest otherwise, I observed. Emergency motions to freeze assets, attempts to lock me out of the foundation, demands for the return of even personal gifts. Richard waved a dismissive hand. Initial positioning, standard procedure. I've instructed them to adopt a more collaborative approach moving forward. I wondered if this conciliatory shift had occurred before or after he'd received Sophia's financial disclosures that afternoon. The documents revealing Campbell Holdings, the Oregon property, and my decades of independent financial planning. Richard's carefully neutral expression revealed nothing. I'm glad to hear it, I replied, matching his reasonable tone. Protracted litigation benefits no one except the attorneys. Relief flickered across his features. He believed I was receptive to settlement discussions, perhaps even reconciliation. Richard had always been skilled at reading business opponents, but surprisingly blind to the emotional nuances of personal relationships. Exactly, he agreed, warming to his theme. We could resolve this privately, reasonably. Two adults who've shared a lifetime finding an equitable path forward. The server appeared to take our orders. Without asking, Richard ordered for both of us. His usual ribeye for himself and the salmon for me. Though I'd secretly always preferred the filet. Actually, I interjected, I'll have the filet, medium rare, and a side of the mushrooms, not the asparagus. Both Richard and the server looked momentarily startled. For 40 years, I had deferred to Richard's selections, accepting the meals he chose as if they were my preference. This small assertion of independent taste seemed to unsettle him more than our legal maneuvers had. After the server departed, Richard took a measured sip of wine before continuing. I've been thinking about practical arrangements. The house in Lakeside is larger than either of us needs individually. I could purchase a condominium for you, something manageable but elegant. Perhaps in that building on Lakeshore Drive you've always admired. And there it was, the first real indication that he hadn't yet reviewed Sophia's financial disclosures. He still believed I needed his financial support, his provision of housing, his continued management of my life. "That's very thoughtful," I replied carefully, "but I've already made arrangements for my future residence." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? Something temporary, I assume." "Actually, no. I have a lovely property on the Oregon coast. It's where I plan to relocate once our affairs are settled in Chicago." His hand stilled on the stem of his wine glass. "Oregon? You've never mentioned any interest in the Pacific Northwest." "I suggested a vacation home there 12 years ago," I reminded him. "You said, and I quote, 'Who wants to spend time in the dreary Pacific Northwest?'" Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed swiftly by confusion. "You're not seriously considering moving across the country. Your entire life is here. The foundation, our friends, Daniel." "Daniel is a grown man with his own life," I pointed out. "As for the foundation, we've already established I can maintain my role remotely. Modern technology makes distance irrelevant for most operational needs." Richard studied me with growing wariness. "And how exactly do you plan to maintain yourself in this Oregon fantasy? The divorce settlement hasn't even been negotiated yet." The moment had arrived. I took a deliberate sip of water, watching him over the rim of the glass. "Financial arrangements won't be an issue, Richard. I own the Oregon property outright." His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That's not possible. All our properties are jointly held." "The Oregon cottage isn't a joint asset," I explained calmly. "I purchased it 12 years ago through Campbell Holdings LLC, a company you're not affiliated with." Richard set down his glass with precise control, though I could see the tension in his fingers. "Campbell Holdings?" "Yes. Established with the inheritance my grandmother left me 35 years ago, the money you wanted me to add to our joint accounts, but I chose to invest independently." Understanding was dawning across his features, along with something I rarely saw in Richard Wright, genuine shock. "You're telling me you've maintained separate finances for decades without my knowledge?" "Not all my finances," I clarified. "Just the portion that originated from my family and was explicitly gifted to me, not us. The portion that has now grown to provide me with financial independence." Richard's jaw tightened. "So this entire divorce drama, your apparent confidence, your refusal to seek temporary support, it's all been based on some secret account you've been hiding." "Not hiding, Richard. Managing privately. There's a distinction." I met his gaze directly. "You've maintained your separate professional identity throughout our marriage. I simply created mine more discreetly." He leaned back, reassessing me as if seeing a stranger across the table. In many ways, he was. Eleanor Campbell had existed, alongside Mrs. Richard Wright for decades, quietly building resources and making plans that the self-absorbed Richard had never noticed. "Your lawyer's financial disclosures," he said after a moment. "They revealed all this today." "Yes. Along with documentation of approximately $400,000 in marital assets you've spent on extramarital affairs over the past 3 years." The color drained from Richard's face, then returned in an angry flush. "Those were business expenses." "Hotel rooms at the Peninsula on nights you claim to be working late? Jewelry purchases that never made their way to my collection? Weekly cash withdrawals that correlate perfectly with Vanessa's hiring date?" I shook my head sadly. "The financial records tell a very clear story, Richard." For perhaps the first time in 40 years, Richard Wright was speechless. The careful script he'd prepared for this dinner, the magnanimous offers, the subtle reminders of my supposed dependence, the implied threats of what I'd lose without him, had been rendered useless by the revelation of my financial autonomy. When our meals arrived, We ate in strained silence, the elegant restaurant continuing its sophisticated hum around our private implosion. Richard mechanically cut his steak while I savored each bite of my fillet, a small pleasure I'd denied myself for decades in deference to his preferences. Finally, Richard set down his fork and looked at me with new eyes. Not angry now, but genuinely perplexed. "Why did you agree to meet tonight? You clearly don't need my financial support. You're not interested in reconciliation. What purpose does this dinner serve?" I dabbed my lips with the linen napkin, considering his question. Closure, perhaps. Or maybe I wanted one conversation where we met as equals, not as benefactor and dependent, not as chairman and supportive wife, but as two individuals who spent 4 decades together and are now choosing different paths. "Equals," he repeated, testing the word. "Is that how you see us now?" "It's how we've always been, Richard. You just never recognized it." I set my napkin beside my plate. "I contributed differently, but equally to our success, managing your household, raising your son, supporting your career, building your foundation's community relationships. The fact that you never valued those contributions doesn't diminish them." Richard's expression darkened. "So this entire divorce, the public humiliation, the legal maneuvers, the foundation confrontation, it's all revenge for feeling underappreciated?" "Not revenge," I corrected gently. "Self-respect. At 65, I've decided to spend whatever time I have left being valued for who I am, not tolerated for the support I provide." Something shifted in Richard's eyes, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of recognition. "And there's nothing I can say that would change your mind?" "The time for that was years ago, Richard, when I suggested the Oregon vacation home, when I tried to discuss taking a more public role in the foundation, when I asked you directly about Jessica, then Michelle, then Vanessa." I met his gaze steadily. "You had 40 years of opportunities to see me as a partner rather than an accessory. You chose not to." We declined dessert by mutual, unspoken agreement. As the server processed Richard's credit card, we sat in silence that was neither comfortable nor entirely hostile, simply the quietness of two people who had said what needed saying and now faced the practical business of disentanglement. "What happens now?" Richard finally asked as we prepared to leave. "Our lawyers will continue negotiating the division of marital assets," I replied. "I'll maintain my role with the foundation while transitioning to remote work. Once the divorce is finalized, I'll relocate to Oregon." "And us?" The question contained a vulnerability I'd rarely heard from Richard Wright. "There is no us anymore, Richard," I said gently. "Just two people who once shared a life and now move forward separately." Outside the restaurant, Richard's driver waited with the sleek black Mercedes that had been a fixture of our married life. From force of habit, I started toward it before catching myself. "I have a cab coming," I explained, stepping back. Richard hesitated, then extended his hand formally, the businessman's gesture that had defined our relationship from the beginning. "Goodbye, Eleanor Campbell." I took his hand briefly, noting how strange it felt to touch him without the familiar weight of obligation and performance. "Goodbye, Richard." As his car pulled away into the Chicago night, I felt neither triumph nor regret, just the curious lightness of having finally spoken my truth after decades of silence. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my Oregon cottage, watching Pacific waves crash against the rocky coastline. The divorce had finalized with surprising efficiency once Richard accepted the reality of my financial independence. Our joint assets had been divided equitably, the lakeside house sold, investments allocated, art and furnishings distributed according to attachment rather than value. The foundation continued under our shared leadership, with Richard handling Chicago operations while I managed program development remotely. Twice-monthly video conferences maintained our professional connection while allowing personal distance. To everyone's surprise, including perhaps his own, Richard had ended his relationship with Vanessa shortly after our Gibson's dinner. Whether from genuine self-reflection or image management, I couldn't say. Daniel had visited the Oregon cottage twice, bringing Olivia on the second trip. Away from Richard's influence and Chicago's social pressures, our relationship had deepened into something more authentic than we'd managed in years. He'd confessed his growing dissatisfaction with following Richard's corporate path, tentatively exploring his long-suppressed interest in educational work. The cottage that had once been my secret escape had transformed into my permanent home, its cozy rooms gradually filling with items chosen solely for my pleasure, not to impress visitors or reflect status. The small painting studio I'd added to the sunroom hummed with activity most mornings, as I finally returned to the artistic pursuits I'd abandoned when marrying Richard. A blue Toyota pulled into the gravel driveway, Grace arriving for her monthly visit. Unlike my Chicago acquaintances who had drifted away once I no longer served as their connection to Richard Wright, Grace had remained constant, our friendship deepening as we entered this new phase of life together. "Still living the dream?" she called as she made her way up the path, silver hair whipping in the ocean breeze. "My dream, finally," I confirmed, embracing her. "How was the flight?" "Uneventful. Margaret Winters sends her regards. The literacy program expansion is exceeding expectations." We settled on the deck chairs, Grace accepting a glass of the Oregon Pinot Noir I'd discovered and come to love. My taste, not Richard's. "Any regrets?" Grace asked after a comfortable silence, her gaze on the horizon where the setting sun painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. I considered the question seriously, as I had many times over the past months. Regrets about the years spent? Yes. Regrets about leaving? Not one. And Richard? "He's adapting," I said. "We spoke last week about the summer reading initiative. He was. Different. Less dismissive. More attentive. Almost as if he's finally learning to see the women in his life as complete people, not extensions of himself." "Too little. Too late," Grace observed. "For us, yes. But maybe not for his future relationships." I sipped my wine thoughtfully. "Or for his relationship with Daniel." As darkness fell over the Pacific, we moved inside to the warm glow of the cottage. The walls now displayed my own paintings alongside treasured mementos, not the carefully curated status symbols of the lakeside house, but genuine reflections of a life fully lived and choices freely made. Later that evening, after Grace had retired to the guest room, I stood at the kitchen window, watching moonlight shimmer across the restless ocean. At 65, I had finally become the woman I might have been all along. Not Mrs. Richard Wright, not even Eleanor Campbell, the secret investor, but simply Eleanor, living authentically at last. The journey hadn't been easy. The confrontations had been painful, the social consequences real. Yet standing in my own kitchen, in my own home, making my own choices, I knew with absolute certainty that I would choose this path again without hesitation. Some might call it a late blooming. I preferred to think of it as perfect timing. After all, the most spectacular flowers often emerge not in the hasty abundance of spring, but in the rich, mature fullness of autumn. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.